Stop! Don't let that fluid reach her veins. Henry's weathered voice echoed through Riverside Memorial's executive wing, shattering the practiced quiet. The 68-year-old janitor lunged toward the hospital bed, dropping his mop with a clatter. As he pointed at the IV dripping clear liquid toward Emma Blackwell's arm, the unconscious 22-year-old daughter of Dr. Richard Blackwell, the hospital's formidable CEO, heads turned in shock. A nurse froze mid-step, hands still on the IV line she'd been about to connect. Dr. Mercer, the hospital's renowned neurologist, stepped between Henry and the bed, his face flushing with indignation. "What do you think you're doing?" Mercer's voice cut like a scalpel. "Security! Remove this man immediately!" But Henry stood his ground, shoulders square despite the arthritis that had bent them over decades of mopping floors. "I spent 40 years as a military pharmacist before pushing this mop. Doctor, that solution smells like bitter almonds. It's cyanide." Dr. Blackwell rose from where he'd been reviewing his daughter's chart at the foot of her bed. His expression shifted from disbelief to concern, eyes darting between the janitor and the IV bag. "What are you talking about?" "Sir, please look at the IV bag," Henry insisted, voice steady despite his racing heart. "There are crystalline formations at the bottom. That's not normal saline. Something's been added to it," Dr. Mercer scoffed, adjusting his pristine white coat. "Dr. Blackwell, I apologize for this interruption. This man clearly doesn't understand medical procedures and is disrupting your daughter's care. I'll have him—" "Wait!" Dr. Blackwell raised a hand, moving closer to the IV stand. The administrator in him wanted to dismiss this janitor's wild claims, but the father in him couldn't. Take the risk? He leaned in, examining the bag with narrowed eyes. "There is something in the solution, crystalline structures." He immediately clamped the IV line. "Get a new bag and line, now." As if on cue, Emma's body suddenly stiffened, her back arching. Off the bed as seizures took hold, the monitors erupted in frantic beeping, their steady rhythm dissolving into chaos. "She's crashing." The nurse rushed to the bedside, pushing past Henry. "Atropine!" Dr. Blackwell barked, his clinical training overriding his panic. "And get the cyanide kit from the emergency cart. Move!" Two security guards burst through the door, momentarily confused about who to approach, the disheveled janitor or the agitated doctors. "Detain that man!" Dr. Mercer pointed at Henry, his finger trembling slightly. "He's disrupting critical care." "No," Dr. Blackwell countermanded, voice firm despite the fear etched on his face. "Let him stay." He turned to Henry as the medical team worked frantically on his daughter. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Henry straightened, his dignity returning. 20 minutes ago, a man in a lab coat I didn't recognize entered this room. He injected something into that IV bag when the nurse stepped out. "I know what cyanide smells like from my military days." "That's cyanide, sir." Dr. Mercer rolled his eyes. "Richard, this is absurd. The old man is confused or seeking attention. I want that bag tested, immediately." Dr. Blackwell's voice cut like steel. The CEO's authority, momentarily forgotten in the crisis, reasserted itself with crushing force. Within minutes, a preliminary test confirmed Henry's suspicion. The solution contained cyanide. Emma's seizures subsided as the antidote took effect, her vital signs slowly stabilizing on the monitors. Dr. Blackwell's professional composure crumbled as he gripped his daughter's hand. The powerful hospital administrator transformed into simply a terrified father. "Who would do this?" he whispered, more to himself than anyone in the room. Behind them, Henry quietly retrieved his fallen mop, attempting to fade back into invisibility as chaos continued around Emma's bed. He'd done what was needed. Now it was time to disappear. "Get security footage from the last hour," Dr. Blackwell ordered a nearby administrator. "I want to know everyone who entered this room." As Henry pushed his cart toward the door, Dr. Blackwell looked up, catching his eye across the room. Something passed between them, recognition, gratitude, and the silent acknowledgement of unexpected allies in a battle neither yet understood. Dr. Blackwell realized he didn't know the janitors. "Name? Jenkins, sir?" "Henry Jenkins." "Mr. Jenkins, please don't go far. We need to talk." 3 weeks earlier, Henry Jenkins arrived at Riverside Memorial Hospital at 4:15 a.m., just as he had for the past 30 years. The night security guard, Marcus, greeted him with the same nod they'd exchanged thousands of times before. "Morning, Henry. Cold one today?" "Morning." Henry stamped his feet against the chill as he signed in. "Knees telling me snow by afternoon." Marcus chuckled. "Better than the weatherman." Henry collected his cart from the maintenance closet, checking his supplies with practiced efficiency. Mop heads, disinfectant, clean rags, gloves. The ritual comforted him, bringing order to the day ahead. After decades of military precision, these simple routines kept him grounded. Most people saw only an old janitor, if they saw him at all. Few knew he'd served as a military pharmacist for 27 years, supervising medication distribution for an entire combat hospital in Desert Storm, then 2 tours in Afghanistan. Even fewer knew why he'd chosen to push a mop instead of filling prescriptions after retirement from service. The haunting memory of improperly mixed medications that had cost lives overseas made him wary of returning to pharmacy work as a civilian. Early morning hours were Henry's favorite. Hospitals had a different personality before dawn. Honest, vulnerable, no administrators rushing about, no visitors cluttering hallways, just the quiet hum of machines keeping people alive, and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes on freshly polished floors. In these quiet moments, Henry often felt he knew the hospital better than those who ran it. He always started on the 8th floor, the executive wing where wealthy donors and VIPs recovered in private rooms. Hospital policy required these rooms be cleaned before 6 a.m. Heaven forbid the important people be disturbed by the sight of actual cleaning. Henry had long ago stopped resenting this policy and instead used it to appreciate the pre-dawn tranquility. That Tuesday, Henry was mopping near the east stairwell when the door swung open. He stepped back into an alcove, a reflexive movement. Born from years of learning to be invisible, invisibility had its advantages. People spoke freely around cleaning staff, as if the uniform somehow rendered the person wearing it deaf. Dr. Mercer and Dr. Phillips emerged, their voices low but intense. Henry froze, not wanting to interrupt. "The board votes next Friday," Dr. Mercer was saying. "If she wakes up before then and remembers what she saw, I understand the stakes." Dr. Phillips sounded nervous. "But she's Richard's daughter. If anything happens to her, if she talks, we all go down. The foundation, the new wing, everything. You think Richard's feelings matter more than that? There must be another way besides making sure she never wakes up. The accident was convenient, I'll grant you that. But she's responding to treatment too well. I've adjusted her medication, but she's young, resilient." Henry's grip tightened on his mop. They couldn't possibly be discussing what it sounded like. "I've arranged something that will look like a complication. Natural causes, untraceable." The doctors moved away, their voices fading. Henry stood motionless, his heart pounding. That evening, he saw the news about Emma Blackwell's car accident that had left her in a coma. The CEO's daughter, the same. When the doctors had been discussing, for days, Henry wrestled with what he'd heard. He was less than a year from retirement, with a pension he and Martha had planned their future around. They'd already put a deposit on that small cabin by Lake Champlain. Speaking up against senior doctors with nothing but an overheard conversation. They'd fire him, maybe worse. Yet each night he saw his own daughter's face in his dreams instead of Emma's. Sarah had been gone 20 years now. Another hospital, another medical complication. The official report said anaphylactic shock from an antibiotic, but Henry had recognized the signs of potassium overdose, the same untraceable method Mercer had mentioned. No one had listened to his concerns then. The hospital had closed ranks, protected their own. Henry began carrying a small notebook in his pocket, documenting times, places, people. He adjusted his cleaning schedule to pass by Emma's room more frequently. One evening he paused in the doorway, watching Dr. Blackwell asleep in the chair beside his daughter's bed, and recognized the slump of those shoulders the same way. He'd sat beside Sarah's bed all those years ago. the same helplessness in the face of a system larger than any individual. In that moment, something hardened in Henry's resolve. Perhaps he couldn't save Sarah again, but Emma might still have a chance. Henry rearranged his cleaning schedule with a deliberate casualness that wouldn't raise suspicions. "My knees do better, starting from the top floors in the mornings," he explained to his supervisor, who barely looked up from her clipboard before signing off on the change. The woman had never questioned his work in 30 years. Why would she start now? That small administrative adjustment gave Henry legitimate access to the executive wing during crucial early morning hours. He identified 3 maintenance closets with perfect sightlines to Emma's room and the adjacent nursing station. From these vantage points he began his careful observation, the same methodical surveillance he'd once used to monitor medication distribution in field hospitals. On the 3rd day, Henry noticed something that made his blood run cold. Dr. Mercer, believing himself alone, changed medication orders in Emma's chart when the night nurse stepped away. Henry watched through the narrow gap in the closet door as Mercer's fountain pen scratched across the paper, altering dosages with subtle marks. The doctor's furtive glances down the hallway betrayed his intentions more clearly than any confession could have. Henry befriended Sandra, a veteran night nurse with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner who reminded him of his late daughter. He timed his floor polishing to coincide with her breaks, offering the small kindnesses that maintenance staff and nurses often exchanged. A fresh coffee, a saved pastry from the cafeteria, a sympathetic ear. "Terrible about Dr. Blackwell's daughter," he mentioned one night, pouring coffee from his thermos into her mug. Sandra sighed, the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift evident in the slump of her shoulders. "It's strange. She was improving last week, then suddenly developed complications. Her latest blood work makes no sense." "How so?" Henry kept his tone casual, the same way he'd inquire about a clogged sink or burned-out light. "Her medication levels don't match what we're administering. Dr. Mercer says it's just her metabolism, but—" She shook her head, lowering her voice. "I've been here 20 years. Something feels wrong." During lunch breaks, Henry slipped into the medical library, using his hospital ID to access journals and drug references. The familiar chemical names and interactions awakened knowledge he'd buried years ago. His pharmacy training came back quickly as he researched the medications in Emma's chart, identifying interactions and contraindications that raised alarming questions. He created a separate notebook with his analysis, using the precise handwriting that had once labeled critical medications in combat zones. The patterns were unmistakable. Emma's treatment protocol was being systematically sabotaged. At home, Martha noticed his distraction as he pushed his meatloaf around his plate. "Henry, you're barely touching your dinner. What's wrong?" he considered, telling her everything, but saw the worry lines around her eyes as she adjusted her reading glasses. Their retirement savings could stretch, but not without his pension. The down payment on their lake cabin had already depleted their emergency fund. Instead, he squeezed her hand. "Just tired, sweetheart. You're working too hard for a man your age," she said, pressing her palm against his cheek. "Just a few more months till retirement." That night, Henry lay awake until Martha's breathing settled into the gentle rhythm of sleep. Then he made his decision. Late the following evening, Henry took a calculated risk. Using his master key, he entered an administrative office and searched for records of the charity gala where Emma had supposedly overheard something significant. The beam from his small flashlight illuminated row after row of meticulous files until he found photographs showing Emma accidentally entering a private meeting room where Dr. Mercer, Dr. Phillips, and the hospital's CFO were huddled over spreadsheets. The sound of approaching footsteps sent him scrambling. With nowhere to go, Henry climbed onto a desk and pushed aside a ceiling tile, hoisting himself into the crawlspace above with a strength that surprised him. Dust filled his lungs as he suppressed. A cough, fiberglass insulation scratching against his forearms. Below, Dr. Mercer entered with someone Henry couldn't see. "The audit's scheduled for next month," an unfamiliar voice said. "We need to resolve the Blackwell problem before then." "I've found someone who can help us," Mercer replied. "Experienced with making problems disappear. Expensive, but reliable. And untraceable, completely. A natural complication. By this time next week, Richard will be too busy arranging a funeral to worry about financial discrepancies." Henry's blood ran cold. That night, his hands trembling with purpose rather than age, he placed his old military phone, modified to record, in a vent near Emma's room. The next morning he retrieved it, heart pounding as he played back a conversation that confirmed. "His worst fears make it look like a reaction to the transfusion," Dr. Mercer's voice explained. "The potassium will stop her heart within minutes." Later that day, Henry watched from his closet vantage point as an unfamiliar technician entered the restricted medication room using Dr. Mercer's keycard. His decision was made. This was no longer about his job or retirement. It was about preventing history from repeating itself. Henry arrived at Riverside Memorial at 3:30 a.m., 2 hours before his scheduled shift. The night was still wrapped around the building like a shroud. The parking lot nearly empty except for staff vehicles with frost-covered windshields. His old Ford pickup, which Martha kept suggesting they replace, coughed twice before falling silent. Inside, the hospital corridors were lit with that peculiar overnight lighting, bright enough for safety but dim enough to suggest sleep should be happening. Somewhere, the antiseptic smell seemed stronger at this hour, undiluted by the sense of food, flowers, and visitors that would arrive with daylight. The night security guard, younger than Marcus and clearly bored, barely glanced up from his phone. "Jenkins, you're early." "Just catching up on some work," Henry muttered, the lie bitter on his tongue. In 47 years of military and civilian service, he'd never falsified a time card or shirked a duty. The moral compromise felt like a small stone in his shoe, uncomfortable but necessary for the journey ahead. He positioned himself in the small alcove near the pharmacy department, cart arranged to appear as if he was taking inventory of cleaning. Supplies. The maintenance clipboard in his hands contained not supply counts, but a hand-drawn map of the floor with times and positions marked in his precise handwriting. At 4:15, his vigilance paid off. The same lab technician from yesterday, young, thin, with nervous eyes, and a lanyard that read Davis Laboratory Services, approached the medication room, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder. Henry noted how the man's hospital ID badge seemed newer than his anxious demeanor would suggest. 15 minutes later, Dr. Mercer appeared, checking his watch with irritation. His normally immaculate appearance showed subtle signs of strain. A crooked tie, a coffee stain on his cuff. The two men barely acknowledged each other as they disappeared into a supply closet. Henry inched his cart closer to the door, the familiar ache in his lower back momentarily forgotten. "Half now, half after it's done," Dr. Mercer's voice came through faintly. No mistakes this time. Her vitals are stronger than expected. When they emerged, Henry glimpsed the exchange, an envelope. Passed to the technician, who quickly pocketed it. The technician clutched a small vial with a red cap that Henry instantly recognized from thousands of military medication inventories. Potassium chloride, lethal in high doses and nearly untraceable if administered carefully. The same substance he suspected had killed his Sarah. "She gets the new IV at 6:30, Mercer instructed, adjusting his stethoscope with practiced nonchalance. "Blackwell always gets coffee then. You'll have a 5-minute window." "What if the same nurse is there?" The technician's voice betrayed his inexperience. "I've arranged the schedule. Anderson will be on break. Morris is covering. She's new and won't question my orders." Henry followed at a safe distance, his decades-old skills of moving quietly through hospital corridors serving him well. The squeak in his left shoe seemed thunderous to his ears, but neither man turned around. Through the glass partition of the preparation room, he watched as gloved hands prepared an IV bag, injecting the contents of the red-capped vial with practiced precision. The technician labeled it with Emma's information and placed it in the transport container. Henry's heart hammered against his ribs, a rhythm so forceful he feared it might be audible. A cold sweat broke across his forehead as the reality of what he was witnessing settled over him. This wasn't speculation anymore. It was murder in progress. He retreated to a staff bathroom, hands trembling as he dialed hospital security from his cell phone. The mirror reflected a face he barely recognized, pale, determined, decades of carefully maintained invisibility about to be shattered. Security, Mills speaking. "There's a technician preparing a contaminated IV for Emma Blackwell," Henry whispered urgently. "Who is this?" "Henry Jenkins, maintenance. Please, you need to—" "Jenkins? Aren't you the guy who's always complaining about missing supplies? Look, we can't chase down every—" Henry hung up, a bitter taste in his mouth. Of course they wouldn't. Believe him. Why would they? He hurried to Emma's floor, joints protesting with each step, positioning his cart near her room. The hallway lights had brightened to morning levels, staff beginning to appear for the day shift. At 6:25, Dr. Blackwell predictably headed toward the cafeteria, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. Minutes later, the technician arrived with the IV bag, nestled in its innocent-looking container. Henry watched through the crack in the door as the technician hung the poisoned bag on the stand. Dr. Mercer appeared almost immediately after, clipboard in hand, creating the appearance of a routine check. "I'll connect the new solution," Mercer told the nurse, a young woman Henry didn't recognize. "You're needed in room 804. As the nurse left and Mercer reached for the IV line, Henry felt time. Slow down. 40 years of military discipline warred with 30 years of keeping his head down. His pension, Martha's security, their lakeside cabin, all balanced against a young woman's life. Sarah's face flashed in his mind. His daughter, lost to a medical error that no one ever answered for. The silent promise he'd made at her grave. Before he could second-guess himself, Henry burst through the door. "Stop! Don't let that fluid reach her veins." And just like that, Henry Jenkins, the invisible man, became impossible to ignore. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of security personnel, police officers, and hospital administrators. Henry's simple maintenance uniform felt increasingly out of place amidst the parade of suits, badges, and white coats that flowed through the executive wing, now transformed into an impromptu command center. The lab technician, identified as Trevor Morris, a recent hire with falsified credentials, was apprehended in the parking garage, a duffel bag and one-way bus ticket to Montreal in his possession. The security footage showed him clearly, entering Emma's room, tampering with the IV, exchanging glances with Dr. Mercer. It was all there in high-definition clarity. Dr. Mercer was escorted from the building in handcuffs, his expensive Italian shoes squeaking against the polished floor he'd walked thousands of times before. His professional mask crumbled into rage as he passed Henry in the hallway. "You're just a janitor," he spat, struggling against the detective's grip. "Who the hell would believe you over me? Do you know who I am?" Henry met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir, I know exactly who you are." The evidence presentation took place in Dr. Blackwell's office, a room Henry had cleaned for decades but never properly entered. The leather chairs felt uncomfortably soft after years of plastic breakroom seats. Coffee was served in actual porcelain, not the styrofoam cups from the staff lounge. Detective Sawyer, a sharp-eyed woman with prematurely grey hair, listened intently as Henry methodically unpacked 3 weeks' worth of evidence. His notebook, with dates and times, recorded conversations from his hidden phone, photographs of altered medical records, and his detailed analysis of Emma's medication irregularities. "You documented all this while working your regular shifts?" she asked, eyebrows raised as she flipped through pages of meticulous notes. "Yes, ma'am. And you recognized the potassium chloride by sight because 40 years as a military pharmacist before I retired. Fort Detrick, then field hospitals in Desert Storm and Afghanistan." Henry shifted uncomfortably under the attention. "I know what medications look like when they're being misused." Dr. Blackwell sat silently, fingers steepled against his lips, eyes never leaving Henry's face. The exhaustion of weeks keeping vigil by his daughter's bedside was etched in the lines around his eyes, deepened now by the shock of betrayal. At noon, Emma Blackwell opened her eyes for the first time in weeks. The news spread through the hospital like electricity. By evening, she was able to speak in short sentences, pieces of memory returning like scattered puzzle pieces finding their way home. The charity gala, she whispered to her father and the detective from her hospital bed, voice raspy from weeks of disuse. I was looking for the restroom. Wrong door. Saw Dr. Mercer with spreadsheets. 2 sets of books. Millions. Diverted. From the Children's Wing Fund, the investigation expanded rapidly. Financial auditors discovered that over $8 million earmarked for hospital development had been siphoned to offshore accounts. Dr. Phillips confessed that the scheme had been operating for years, with Dr. Mercer and the hospital's CFO falsifying records and inflating contracts with vendors who provided kickbacks. The hospital board convened an emergency session as national media descended on Riverside Memorial. Hospital scandal attempted. Murder of CEO's daughter, the headline screamed. Janitor hero uncovers millions in fraud. Henry found the attention excruciating. Young reporters cornered him in hallways, thrust microphones toward his face, asking how it felt to be a hero. Doctors who had never acknowledged his existence suddenly knew his name, offering handshakes and backslaps that felt foreign after decades of invisibility. Nurses who had previously seen through him now brought him coffee, saved him desserts from the cafeteria. He contemplated taking early retirement just to escape the spotlight. Martha fielded calls from distant relatives and neighbors they barely knew, all suddenly interested in their quiet lives. 3 days after the failed poisoning attempt, Henry was summoned to Emma's room. He entered hesitantly, cap in hand, feeling oddly underdressed despite wearing his Sunday clothes rather than his uniform. Emma was sitting up, still pale but alert, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that emphasized her youth and vulnerability. Dr. Blackwell stood beside her bed, his imposing frame somehow diminished by recent events. "Mr. Jenkins," Emma said softly, "my father told me what you did." Henry nodded awkwardly. "Just did what needed doing, miss. You saved my life while risking everything." Her eyes, so like her father's, held his steadily. "Why?" Henry looked down at his weathered hands, fingers gnarled from years of work, spotted with age. The question cut to the heart of something he'd avoided discussing for 20 years. 20 years ago, my daughter Sarah died from what they called a medical error. Nobody listened when I questioned it. I couldn't let history repeat itself. 6 months passed. Spring sunshine streamed through the windows of Riverside Memorial's newly renovated East Wing as Henry Jenkins walked the corridor, not pushing a mop, but wearing a simple blue blazer with an ID badge that read, "Patient Safety Consultant." The morning light caught the silver in his hair, earned through decades of work that had gone largely unnoticed until now. The Jenkins Protocol had been implemented in 17 hospitals across the state, a system that created anonymous reporting channels for staff at all levels. Posters showing a simplified version of the protocol hung in staff areas, featuring a silhouette that bore a suspicious resemblance to Henry's lanky frame. The protocol wasn't just paperwork. It had already prevented 3 serious medication errors at Riverside alone, according to the quarterly safety report that now sat on every department head's desk. Dr. Blackwell had emerged from the scandal transformed. The imperious administrator was gone, replaced by a more thoughtful leader who regularly ate in the staff cafeteria and knew maintenance workers by name. He'd testified before a congressional committee on healthcare fraud, becoming an unlikely advocate for system-wide reform. The Healthcare Journal that once featured him for cost-cutting measures now profiled his work on transparency and accountability. "Mr. Jenkins, the residents are ready for you," called a young doctor who once would have walked past Henry without a glance. She held the door open with deference that still made Henry uncomfortable. The teaching room was filled with eager faces. 20 Residents in their crisp white coats, notebooks open. Henry remembered cleaning this room after hours, straightening chairs no one had bothered to push in. 3 times weekly, Henry taught medical residents about medication safety and the importance of listening to concerns from every level of hospital. Operations. His military pharmacy knowledge, once deemed irrelevant to his janitorial position, was now considered invaluable. Your greatest protection against medical errors, he told the young doctors, isn't technology or protocols. It's creating an environment where everyone feels responsible for patient safety and empowered to speak up. A resident raised her hand. But what if speaking up means risking your job? Henry nodded, appreciating the question. That's why the anonymity safeguards in the protocol matter. But more importantly, it's why leadership has to demonstrate, not just claim, that they value truth over comfort. Emma Blackwell, fully recovered, sat in on these sessions occasionally. She'd abandoned her business school plans to pursue a degree in healthcare ethics, interning in the hospital's newly formed patient advocacy department. Today, she sat in the back row, her notebook filled with ideas for her thesis on institutional accountability. During lunch breaks, Henry still visited his old colleagues in maintenance. They teased him about his blazer, but beamed with pride at what one of their own had accomplished. The hospital's hierarchy was still visible, but the lines had softened. At the faculty lounge, a space Henry had previously entered only to empty trash bins, Dr. Blackwell and the board presented Henry with an award named in his honor to be given annually to staff who demonstrated exceptional courage in patient advocacy. The crystal plaque felt strange in hands, accustomed to mop handles and cleaning supplies. Henry didn't just save my daughter, Dr. Blackwell said to the assembled staff, his voice catching. He saved this institution's soul. Later, as Henry cleaned out his maintenance locker for the final time, he carefully removed a faded photograph. A young woman with his eyes and his wife's smile. Sarah Jenkins, 22 years old, lost to a medication error that hospital administrators had hastily buried. The photograph's edges were worn smooth from years of handling. "I promised you it wouldn't happen to someone else," he whispered to the photograph, running his thumb across the familiar face. "Maybe now it won't." Dr. Blackwell appeared in the doorway, surprising Henry. "Need help carrying anything to your new office?" he asked, stepping tentatively into a space he'd rarely entered before. Henry shook his head. "Not much to bring, never expected to have an office." Dr. Blackwell noticed the photograph. "Is that my daughter? She died from a potassium overdose. Different hospital, same story. Someone cutting corners, then covering it up. I became a janitor afterward. Thought maybe I could protect patients in my own way." Understanding dawned in Dr. Blackwell's eyes. "That's why you recognized what was happening to Emma." Henry nodded, tucking the photograph into his jacket pocket, close to his heart, where it had always been. As they walked together toward the administration wing, staff members nodded respectfully to Henry, not out of pity or novelty, but genuine respect. A nurse supervisor stopped to confirm details for the upcoming safety committee meeting, where Henry would present. "You know," Dr. Blackwell said quietly as they waited for the elevator, "sometimes it takes the humblest eyes to see what the powerful miss and the quietest voice to speak the truth that saves us all." Henry smiled slightly. After decades of invisibility, of being overlooked and underestimated, he had finally been seen, not just for saving Emma, but for who he truly was. A guardian who had found his voice at last.